Cinematic YouTube thumbnail 16:9 full bleed. Ancient Aquarius deity emerging from cosmic waters, eyes calm and knowing, gently pouring luminous divine water from an old clay jar. Sacred water transforms into glowing light waves, symbolizing healing and return. Aquarius figure positioned on the right side covering 60% of the composition. Left side left empty with smooth dark blue to indigo gradient background for text. Surrounding celestial charts, zodiac glyphs, soft radio frequency waves, subtle starlight particles. Color palette aqua blue, indigo, silver light accents, visually rich but not dark. Mood is emotional, reassuring, mystical, timeless, deeply spiritual. High clarity, cinematic lighting, ultra detailed, designed for high CTR astrology content for viewers over 35. No text, no logo, no watermark. If you're Aquarius and this feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not imagining it. Speech balloon comment below, I'm ready. Not because you know what's coming, but because something inside you recognizes this moment. Because what comes next isn't about the past. It's about why it had to leave before it could come back. You know what's strange, Aquarius? The things that change us the most are rarely the ones we announce. They don't arrive with dramatic endings. No slam doors. No public goodbyes. Just a quiet moment where something slips out of your life and never quite comes back the same way. And you didn't talk about it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because explaining it felt heavier than carrying it alone. You're not the kind who collapses in front of people. You've always been the one who adjusts the sails instead of complaining about the storm. So when it happened, you adapted. Silently, elegantly, almost invisibly. Maybe it was a person who once felt like home. Maybe it was a role you carried with pride until it was taken from you without warning. Or maybe, and this is the one most people never see, you lost a version of yourself that you never had the language to grieve. Because how do you mourn someone you used to be when the world keeps applauding who you became instead? You learned how to function without naming the loss. You became reliable, rational, self-contained. You told yourself you were fine, and for a long time that was enough to survive. But survival leaves fingerprints. It shows up in the way you don't ask for much anymore. In the way you hesitate before trusting joy. In how you keep parts of yourself untouched, not because you don't feel deeply, but because you feel everything. Some losses don't scream. They go silent and quietly rearrange your entire inner world. And here's the part no one ever validated for you. You didn't imagine the weight of that absence. It mattered. Even if no one else saw it. Even if you kept moving forward. Especially if you kept moving forward. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being strong too early. From learning how to hold yourself together before anyone taught you how to be held. So tell me something, and you don't have to answer out loud. When you look back, is there something you stopped talking about, not because it healed, but because it became part of your identity? Aquarius, this isn't about reopening old wounds. It's about recognizing the quiet courage it took to keep going without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without closure. You didn't dramatize your pain. You archived it. You placed it somewhere safe inside and told yourself you'd return when there was time. And maybe this moment right here is the first time it feels safe enough to acknowledge what that cost you. Because what was lost didn't just disappear. It shaped you. It refined you. It taught you how to live without guarantees. And before anything can return in your life, before anything aligns again, there's value in honoring what left without explanation. Not to dwell, not to blame, but to finally say, yes, that mattered to me. And as you sit with that truth, as quietly as it arrives, something begins to shift. Not around you, within you. And that shift is where the real story starts to deepen. After a while, something subtle happened. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside. You didn't fall apart. You reorganized. You learned how to live around what was missing, the way a city quietly reroutes itself after a bridge disappears. No announcements, just new paths, new habits, new ways of getting from one place to another without ever crossing that old point again. And you became good at it. Too good. You built a life that worked. You handled responsibilities. You stayed functional. You made yourself useful, capable, composed. People looked at you and thought they figured it out. But what they couldn't see was how much of that strength came from necessity, not choice. Because you didn't heal by feeling everything. You survived by managing it. You learned not to lean too hard on anyone. You learned how to keep your expectations reasonable. You learned how to stay calm, even when something inside you went quiet. Independence started as protection. Then it became identity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you grew a little colder, not toward others, but toward your own needs. Not numb. Just efficient. Here's something few people ever say out loud, especially to someone like you. Stability can be a hiding place. There are many Aquarius over 35 who look settled, accomplished, unshaken, yet feel a low-level emptiness they can't quite name. Not sadness. Not dissatisfaction. Just the sense that something essential never made it back into the picture. Life feels okay. But okay isn't the same as true. So let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you felt deeply alive without needing to explain yourself, without performing strength, without editing your emotional range to stay acceptable? You became adaptable because you had to. You learned how to survive without expecting rescue. You turned clarity into armor, logic into insulation. And for a long time that was wisdom. But survival has a timeline. What once kept you safe can quietly limit how much joy you allow in, how much risk you take on behalf of your own happiness, how deeply you let yourself want something again. You didn't become distant because you stopped caring. You became careful because caring once cost you more than you were ready to lose again. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you learned. But here's the shift that's beginning to whisper now. You're no longer in the same season. The version of you that learned to survive did its job, beautifully, faithfully. And it might be time very soon to ask whether that version still needs to lead. Because there is a difference between being strong enough to endure and being ready to receive. And the moment you start sensing that difference is the moment the story quietly changes again. There's a question that often comes much later, not when the loss happens, not even when you finally feel steady again. It arrives quietly, usually at night, when everything is calm enough to hear yourself think, why did it have to leave at all? And I want to say this to you carefully, because you've spent enough time blaming circumstances, timing, or yourself. What was taken from you was not a punishment. It wasn't the universe testing your strength. It wasn't karma keeping score. It was a separation that had to happen because you were standing on something that could no longer carry you forward. At the time, it felt cruel, unnecessary, like life reached in and removed the very thing that made you feel anchored. But here's what most people never tell Aquarius. You have a way of building your identity around what you hold on to: people, roles, certainty, even ideals. And you do it so gracefully that no one notices how much weight those structures are bearing. The loss didn't come to break you, it came to unfasten you. Because had it stayed, you would have remained loyal to a version of yourself that had already reached its limit. There are chapters we don't outgrow gently. They have to be closed for us. And yes, that kind of ending feels violent in hindsight, but only because you couldn't see yet who you were slowly becoming underneath it all. You needed to learn how to stand without that familiar support. Not to prove independence, but to discover your own center of gravity. And you did. You learned how to orient yourself without permission, how to make decisions without leaning on old definitions, how to survive without borrowing meaning from something external. That kind of growth never happens when everything stays comfortable. Let me ask you something softly. If that loss had never happened, would you have ever questioned the life you were building, or would you still be living inside an identity that once fit but no longer felt alive? What you lost could not follow you into who you were becoming. It belonged to a previous season, a different frequency, and it's okay to miss it. Missing doesn't mean it was meant to stay. Some things leave not because they fail us, but because they've completed their purpose. You weren't abandoned. You were redirected. And the version of you sitting here, now more discerning, more grounded, less willing to betray yourself for stability, is proof that the removal worked. It carved space. It forced clarity. It taught you how to hold yourself without collapsing. And here's the part that changes the tone of everything. You are no longer the person who lost that thing. You are the person who survived the becoming. Which means when something begins to approach your life again, it will be meeting a very different Aquarius, one who knows the cost of attachment and the value of choosing consciously. And that realization quietly, almost imperceptibly, starts to shift how the future approaches you at all. There's a quiet shift that happens before anything truly changes. Not a sign from the outside, not an announcement, just an inner stillness you didn't have before. And that's where you are now. This isn't the year where life suddenly becomes generous. It's the year where you stop bargaining with yourself. You can feel it in small moments. The way you pause before saying yes. The way you no longer rush to fill silence. The way certain choices that once felt safe now feel strangely heavy. You're not chasing anymore. You're listening. And that alone tells me something important. You're no longer operating from need. For a long time, you accepted what fit because it was available. You stayed where you were valued but not fully seen. You chose security over alignment and called it maturity. But something in you has grown quieter and stronger at the same time. You don't need proof anymore. You don't need reassurance dressed as promises. You don't need to convince yourself that something is right just because it doesn't hurt. You've learned the difference between peace and emotional numbness. That's why what approaches your life now doesn't arrive with fireworks. No dramatic returns. No cosmic spectacle. It arrives gently, almost cautiously, as if it's checking whether you are still willing to abandon yourself for comfort, and you're not. You don't reach for it immediately. You don't romanticize it. You observe how your body responds. You notice whether your breath stays steady, whether your chest feels open or tight. This is what readiness looks like, not excitement. Clarity. Let me ask you something softly, honestly. If the same thing returned 5 years ago, would you have accepted it out of longing rather than choice? Because now you don't want something to complete you. You want something that fits beside who you already are. That's why the timing feels different. Not rushed. Not delayed. Just precise. You're no longer willing to trade your inner stability for familiarity. You're no longer impressed by intensity that costs you your peace. And this shift, this grounded knowing, is what quietly recalibrates what life sends your way. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you're ready to hold. And readiness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as discernment. As boundaries that don't need defending. As a calm no and an even calmer yes. What's coming back to you doesn't need to convince you anymore. It meets you where you stand, not where you used to ache. And as you sense that, as you feel how steady you've become, there's a subtle warmth in realizing this time nothing has to be forced. You're finally strong enough to receive without losing yourself. And that changes everything that follows. There's something important you should know before anything truly finds its way back to you. And I want to say it gently, because misunderstanding this is how Aquarius often miss the moment that matters most. What returns rarely arrives in familiar clothing. You've grown enough now to recognize the feeling. That slight pause in your chest. That sense of recognition without certainty. That quiet curiosity that doesn't come with urgency. But the mind wants patterns. It wants proof. It wants the past to reintroduce itself exactly as it left. And that's where you might hesitate. Because you've learned to trust logic. To analyze before opening the door. To wait until something matches the memory you saved of it. But memory is not a map. It's an echo. What's approaching you now isn't trying to recreate what once existed. It's responding to who you are today. And that can feel disorienting. It may not speak the same language. It may not arrive through the same door. It may not carry the emotional intensity you once equated with meaning. In fact, it might feel quieter than you expect. More grounded. Less dramatic. And part of you might wonder, is this really it, or am I settling? That question doesn't come from intuition. It comes from attachment to an old image. Aquarius, your strength has always been your vision. But sometimes that same vision becomes a rigid frame. And when reality doesn't neatly inside it, you dismiss what could have been meaningful because it doesn't look impressive enough. Let me ask you something softly. If something arrived that supported your peace instead of challenging your nervous system, would you recognize it as valuable, or would you mistake calm for lack of depth? The return you're sensing now doesn't want to impress you. It wants to align with you. And alignment doesn't announce itself loudly. It feels natural, almost obvious in hindsight. You've spent years training yourself to survive intensity, to endure complexity, to believe that love or purpose has to be hard-earned. But growth has changed the rules. What fits you now doesn't need to hurt to be real. It doesn't need to recreate old chemistry to feel true. It doesn't need to mirror the past to honor it. If you wait for it to look the same, you'll miss it again. Because this time it's not returning to meet who you were. It's arriving to see whether you're willing to let go of outdated expectations. And yes, that requires trust. A different kind than before. Not blind hope, but embodied knowing. You're no longer here to repeat cycles. You're here to choose consciously. And as you loosen your grip on how it should appear, as you allow yourself to feel instead of evaluate, something subtle happens. You notice your body relax, your breath deepen, your thoughts slow. That's how you'll know. Not because it matches a memory, but because it meets you where you are. And when that realization settles in quietly without urgency, you'll understand why the return had to come this way. Because you're no longer meant to live inside the past. You're meant to recognize what finally fits the present. There's a quiet truth that often reveals itself right here. Not when something is about to arrive, but when you notice what you're still holding. Because before anything meaningful can return to your life, there's a gentle but necessary emptying that has to happen. And this part isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like hesitation. You've learned to keep certain things close not because they nourish you, but because they once kept you from falling apart. Temporary connections. Patterns that distract you just enough to avoid feeling too much. Even the subtle identity of being the one who endured, the one who survived, the one who learned to live without. These weren't mistakes. They were life rafts. They helped you breathe when the water was high. They gave you something to hold when letting go felt impossible. But Aquarius, there comes a moment when staying afloat is no longer the goal. Because what saves you in one season can quietly limit you in the next. Let me ask you something gently. Is there anything in your life right now that feels familiar and safe but also strangely heavy? Something you keep not out of joy but out of habit. Something that dulls the edges so you don't have to feel the full weight of wanting again. You've been strong for a long time. Strong enough to manage without fulfillment. Strong enough to accept substitutes. Strong enough to tell yourself this is enough. But enough isn't the same as aligned. And here's where the deeper truth lives. You can't receive with hands still holding survival. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because survival clenches. It grips, it protects. And receiving requires open palms. This is where many Aquarius hesitate. Because letting go of what once kept you safe feels risky even when it no longer fits. It can feel like betrayal of the version of you that fought so hard to stay standing. But honoring that version doesn't mean staying there forever. It means recognizing that you're no longer in the same storm. You don't need to numb yourself anymore. You don't need placeholders that mimic connection. You don't need to define yourself by what you once lost to justify who you are now. That identity served a purpose. It gave you structure when everything else felt uncertain. But if you keep wearing it, it will quietly block what's trying to meet you next. What's meant to return to your life is looking for space, not competition. It's not asking you to erase your past. It's asking you to loosen your grip on what no longer belongs in your future. And yes, this kind of release feels vulnerable, because it removes the buffer. It brings sensation back online. But it also brings clarity, energy, truth. As you begin to let go, not all at once, not forcefully, just honestly, you may notice something subtle. Your breath deepens. Your body softens. Your inner world becomes quieter, not empty, but receptive. That's how you'll know you're ready. Not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer holding on to things that were only meant to get you through. And in that space, that openness, something new has room to step closer. Not to rescue you, but to meet you as you are now. You feel it first as a shadow across your chest, a hesitation, a tightening that whispers of what could slip away again. It's subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but you know it. You have felt the weight of trust before, the delicate promise of hope that sometimes seemed too fragile to hold. And standing here, you feel that old fear creeping back, the one that tells you, maybe this time, you shouldn't hope too much, maybe this time you should just let it pass. But listen closely, this is different. It isn't the world conspiring against you. It isn't the stars punishing you. It's your own mind, your own heart, rehearsing the old scripts, the patterns you've worn like armor for years. You've survived loss before, Aquarius, and that survival has left you wise. Yes, but it has also left a hollow space where caution lives, whispering that you are not ready, that maybe letting go is safer than trusting again. You might find yourself rationalizing, overthinking, building walls that feel like protection, but are really gates that keep the sunlight out. You might say to yourself, I don't need it anymore. I am fine alone. And part of you is true. Part of you is strong, but another part knows that the fear is masking opportunity, that the hesitation itself can be the only thing standing between you and the return that is quietly approaching. Take a breath. Feel it. That tiny pulse in your chest, the spark of anticipation mingled with trepidation. That is not weakness. That is life nudging you to be conscious. This fear isn't random, it is a test, a delicate reminder that what comes next is sacred. You have the chance to approach it, not as someone desperate, but as someone aware, someone who chooses deliberately. Ask yourself, quietly, softly, what if this time the loss isn't inevitable? What if the falling away doesn't dictate your fate? You can step forward with intention, Aquarius. You can meet what is returning not as a victim of circumstance, but as the author of your own readiness. Your mind may tug at the memories of past missteps, but your heart remembers the lessons, the resilience, the courage that has carried you here. So feel the fear, and then let it teach you. Let it show you where your edges are, where your limits have grown too tight, where your hands have held on to fragments that no longer serve the future you are stepping into. This time, losing won't be fate, it will be a choice. And when you make it consciously, when you allow the courage beneath the caution to rise, you are no longer at the mercy of what was lost, you are ready to receive what is coming. As someone who knows the difference between needing and deserving, can you feel that quiet shift, Aquarius? The one that hums like a current beneath your skin, subtle, undeniable. The moment before the tide turns, before the return arrives not as it was, but as it was always meant to be. That is where your power begins. That is where the story, your story, moves forward. You wake to a quiet morning that feels almost ordinary, but there is something different in the air. It's subtle at first, the light falling differently through the blinds, the way a cup of coffee warms your hands, the way your chest feels lighter, almost as if the weight you've carried for years has finally shifted. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. There is no sudden cosmic announcement, no dramatic fanfare. The universe doesn't crash in. Instead, it slides softly beside you, a gentle tide that lifts your heart without notice. And then you notice it. That spark, that fleeting sense of ease, a moment where you truly smile without realizing it. The kind of smile that is not forced, not borrowed from someone else's happiness, but born entirely from inside. You feel the puzzle pieces of your life clicking together in ways you have longed for, yet never fully imagined. It's not about recompense or repayment. It's not about balance being restored in the ledger of life. It is something far more tender, something profound. This is the return that matters, Aquarius. The one you didn't know how to hope for. The one that cannot be measured by what was lost or what should have been. It arrives precisely when you are ready, not desperate, not seeking, not clinging. You receive it as someone who chooses, not someone who needs. And in that choice lies your freedom, your power, your quiet authority over your own heart. There is a beauty in its subtlety. Perhaps you pause, almost afraid to acknowledge it, because it feels too delicate, too alive to hold without breaking. And yet, the magic is not in holding tight, it is in the awareness that this return mirrors your own evolution. The life you've crafted, the boundaries you've learned to honor, the fears you've dared to face, they have all prepared you for this precise moment. No cosmic accident could have delivered it sooner. You were never late, you were being made ready. Ask yourself, softly, do you feel the difference this time? The way you move through it with calm, rather than with need. The way your heart stretches without fear of snapping. The way your mind recognizes that fulfillment is not a prize, but a companion for those who are fully awake to receive it. And as you breathe, take in the quiet wonder of a life that aligns, not by chance, but by the courage of having endured, adapted, and chosen. The return isn't a replay of the past. It is an invitation to a new rhythm, a new trust, a new version of yourself that you have been nurturing all along. Can you feel it, Aquarius? The soft resonance of alignment, the subtle thrill of what comes when you are fully ready. The story does not end here, it whispers that the next chapter is already on its way, waiting for you to meet it with open hands, open heart, and the quiet knowing that life honors those who choose consciously. And in that knowing, the return is perfect. Before you go, Aquarius, let this settle for a moment. Everything you just heard was not meant to convince you. It was meant to remind you. Because somewhere beneath the noise of the world, beneath the habits you learned just to survive, there is a version of you that has always known when it was time to open and when it was time to wait. That version is still here, calm, observant, quietly powerful. If something in this message softened you, even slightly, that wasn't coincidence. It was resonance. It was your inner compass responding to truth. And here is the part that may surprise you most. Nothing outside of you needs to change first. Not the timing, not the people, not the circumstances. The shift already happened when you chose to listen without fear. So tonight, or whenever this finds you, place one hand on your chest and notice how steady your breath is now. That steadiness is your signal. You are safe to move forward without rushing. You are allowed to receive without questioning your worth. If you feel called, share a word in the comments. Not for explanation. Just one word that describes how you feel right now. You might be surprised how many Aquarius around the world feel the same way at this exact moment. And if this space feels like somewhere you can return to, subscribe. Not out of habit, but out of trust. Trust that the messages meant for you will always find you when you are ready to hear them. This channel isn't here to tell you who to be. It's here to walk beside you while you remember. The journey doesn't end here. It's simply turning another corner. The next message is already forming, carrying a new layer of clarity, a deeper kind of freedom, and a truth you'll recognize instantly. Until then, stay gentle with yourself. Stay honest. And above all, trust your own timing. You were never late. You were becoming. I'll see you in the next message.